Before I dropped the whiteboard and partially erased it, the question said, what does Paul mean by people being baptized for the dead in 1 Corinthians 15:29? So in order to answer that, I'm going to read part of the passage here. I'm going to start with verse 26 and then read down through verse 29. It says, the last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. For he hath put all things under his feet. That is, the Father has put all things under Jesus' feet. But when he saith all things are put under him, it is manifest that he is accepted, which did put all things under him. And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be all in all. Here's verse 29. Else what shall they do which are baptized for the dead, if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the dead? And why stand we in jeopardy every hour? This particular passage in 1 Corinthians 15, the entire chapter is the Apostle Paul talking about the subject of the bodily resurrection. And he gives proof after proof of the fact that if there is no bodily resurrection, then everything we believe is in vain anyway. In the beginning part of chapter 15, which is a very lengthy chapter of 1 Corinthians, he describes what will take place when our physical bodies in this world are changed into a different kind of body, from bodies terrestrial to bodies celestial, he says, and from bodies that are mortal to bodies that are immortal. But here near the end of the chapter, he begins to talk about, he's giving reasons for the fact that it must be so, that we are bodily raised from the dead. And this is a question that I had someone that emailed us that listens to our services every week, and they emailed this question about a month ago, but I had not been able to get to it yet. And the question is, what does Paul mean in verse 29 by people being baptized, quote, for the dead, unquote? And this is one of those passages that, to be honest with you, most preachers don't even want to talk about because it's a difficult passage. And I have known pastors before, you maybe have too, that when there was a difficult passage, they just kind of skipped over it and kept right on going. And if you asked a question, they didn't really do much to answer it. I have always tried as a pastor not to do that. I don't know all the answers, of course, but I'm going to give you three possibilities of what Paul meant by this phrase, being baptized for the dead, and then I'll share with you what I think as your pastor. There is the one sense in the verse here when it says, else what shall they do which are baptized for the dead if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the dead? Now the word for here, the Greek word for, it means for, but it also carries a more specific meaning of for something. It means for the sake of something. So one of the ways of reading this passage is, why are they then baptized for the sake of the dead? And so you ask, well, what does that mean, for the sake of the dead? Well, one of the ways that some Bible commentators have answered this question of what it means is saying that there were people in the church there, undoubtedly, who had loved ones who had been saved and died, passed away, and then they were still alive, but not yet saved. But because of the fact that they had loved ones that had died and were on their way to heaven, in order for them to be able to spend eternity with their loved ones again, they themselves perhaps had gotten saved because of their loved ones who had passed away. And I have preached funerals before where there were people who were being buried who were clearly had been saved, were in heaven, and there were loved ones at the funeral who knew they were not saved, and they ended up getting saved. Some of them actually the day of the funeral specifically because of the witness of their loved ones so that they could see them again. So as I read this again, if you'll keep that in mind, and I'll read that extended definition of the word for, which is what the Greek word means. We're not adding anything to what it says. It's what the Greek word for, which is huper, it's what it means. Else what shall they do which are baptized for the sake of the dead, if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the sake of the dead? So in other words, they were baptized so that their loved ones would get to see them again. Now that's one of the suggestions that commentators have of what it could mean, people being baptized for the dead. A second possibility is the fact that the reality is before we got saved, all of us are dead. We're dead in trespasses and sins. And we know that baptism does not save anyone. That is, water baptism doesn't save anyone. The Apostle Paul talks about that, and so does the Lord Jesus himself. But the notion of being baptized in order to be saved, you do have to be baptized in order to be saved, but it's not being baptized into water. It's being baptized by the Spirit into Christ. We talked about this a little bit actually Sunday morning in Sunday school in our study in the book of Galatians, because Paul says in Romans chapter 6 that when we get saved, we're baptized by the Spirit into Christ. And of course, the word baptize literally means to immerse or to dunk. So we are dunked into Christ. We're totally immersed into Christ and raised with Him at the moment of salvation. So when you consider the fact that we're all dead in trespasses and sins before we're saved, the fact that someone is baptized is an indication perhaps that baptism that happens spiritually when we get saved, or perhaps even indication of the water baptism, which is to follow salvation, because even though it doesn't save anyone, the assumption throughout the New Testament is that everyone who gets saved will want to be baptized. The Bible clearly says in the book of Acts, those that received Him, those that gladly received the Word were baptized. And so it's kind of an assumed thing in the New Testament that if someone gets saved, they're going to want to be baptized. As a pastor, I've always wondered about people that get saved and then for some reason they don't want to be baptized. But let's read the verse again, keeping in mind the potential explanation here that it could be that it's talking about the person who is being baptized. They were dead themselves before they got baptized. So the verse says, else what shall they do which are baptized for the dead, meaning themselves, if the dead rise not at all? Why are they then baptized for the dead, who is themselves? So both of those are possible explanations. There's a third possible explanation as well, and it goes back to something that we talked about when we went through the book of 1 Corinthians verse by verse a couple of years ago, and that is that the city of Corinth was situated there in Greece between Athens and Sparta, as you're looking at it on the map, between Athens and Sparta, in that little bitty, near that isthmus, that little bitty stretch of land, very narrow, that separates the Peloponnesus in southern Greece from the rest of Greece. And near the city of Corinth was a city named Eleusis. And there was one of the mystery cults that was very famous in the ancient world, including at the time in which Paul wrote this. It was known as the Eleusinian Mystery. The Eleusinian Mystery was one of those mystery cults that was related to Mystery Babylon, all the way back to the Tower of Babel. But it centered around some of the Greek mythology of one of the gods who had died and gone to the underworld, and one of the goddesses that had gone to rescue him, and how he was dead and then resurrected again. It's one of those Greek myths that's part of that counterfeit religion that Satan has to mimic the death, the burial, and the resurrection of the Savior. And that Eleusinian mystery included several different aspects that apparently had already affected some in the church there at Corinth, because they had grown up in this culture, and it was just part of everything that went on in the city of Corinth. One of the things Paul had already addressed in the book of 1 Corinthians that dealt with that was the fact that when they were observing the Lord's Supper, they were turning it into just a big feast, basically. And in addition to that, they were treating people differently depending on how wealthy or well off they were or how poor they were. So they had basically made the Lord's Supper into a feast, which was part of the rites every year that went on for the Eleusinian Mysteries. The second thing Paul had already addressed in 1 Corinthians in chapters 13 and 14 was speaking in some unknown tongue. Because while the charismatic churches today would not like to admit it, that belief that tongues is just some supernatural babbling that is a heavenly gibberish language was not in any way something that occurred in the New Testament. Every time speaking in tongues occurs in the New Testament, it is in an actual human language that the person is speaking or the receiver is hearing, not some unintelligible gibberish. But in the Eleusinian Mysteries, again located very near the city of Corinth, this mystery cult had as one of its rituals in the annual goings-on there that the people, after consuming this intoxicating beverage, they would begin to just babble in gibberish. That's why the Apostle Paul deals heavily with the subject of speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians 13 and 14, because not only were the Christians there in the church at Corinth giving the gift of speaking in tongues an undue amount of attention, but some of them were confusing it with what was going on down the road at the Eleusinian Mystery temple. And then here's the third thing: baptism for the dead. Part of the Eleusinian Mysteries, and in fact, just about all of the ancient mystery cults of the pagan world, all had some type of baptism in which a person was dunked in water for the washing away of their sins, to purify not only their physical life here in this world, but to make them spiritually pure for the afterlife. The Eleusinian mystery cult included being baptized to purify the soul for the coming afterlife. Of course, we know today the Mormons do actually go into their temple with their holy underwear on, and they get baptized for dead relatives that have already passed away and been buried, because they believe they're doing what 1 Corinthians 15:29 is talking about, and being baptized for their loved ones that have gone on in the hopes that they will one day be able to enjoy celestial enjoyment. But that, I'm quite certain, Paul certainly is not condoning it in this passage, anything of someone being baptized for the sake of the dead, to help the dead in any way. Paul is not condoning this belief. He's also here not directly attacking it, which leads me to believe that he probably wasn't even thinking of this third option, the Eleusinian mystery part, as far as what he was talking about. But that doesn't mean that the church there at Corinth wasn't thinking about this idea of being baptized to help out somebody that had already died and gone on, that in some way it was going to help them, like burning a candle for them in the Catholic Church, or being baptized for them after they're already dead, like the Mormon Church does. I think what the Apostle Paul is simply saying is that, listen, even the lost people that participate in all of these pagan religions around us, they believe enough in a resurrection of the dead, that there has to be an afterlife. There has to be something more than this world, else why would they do what they do? I don't think he's saying we should do it, but I do think he's saying that it's a proof that even the lost believe in an afterlife, that there must be something more. And I think for the Christians, he's saying, listen, you yourselves know that you've been baptized, both baptized spiritually into Christ and baptized in water afterwards to show that you're saved. It would be in vain for you to have been baptized if there is no resurrection of the dead. And if there is no resurrection of the dead, all those pagans that are doing it, they must be wrong too. But even they realize intuitively that there must be something more when you take your last breath than just this life.